Have you ever noticed when watching an anime that the main characters have a tendency to form up in groups of 3? And even more interestingly, that the archetypes within this trio are often pretty darn similar even between series? There's the loud and impulsive one, the quiet and serious one, and then there's the third person who's kinda just trying to make things work. Well, this isn't an accident or some bizarre coincidence. This is actually a very common trope within the shonen genre and within anime as a whole. It's known as the Freudian Trio, and the way that it's used within a show has a pretty big impact on the quality of the series as a whole. So as you could have guessed, the Freudian Trio is named after the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud himself. And thankfully, the concept takes inspiration from Freud's more uncontroversial theories of human development. In Freud's theory of the unconscious, he elaborated on the 3 key components of the human psyche, namely the id, the superego, and the ego. The id is responsible for the impulsive and instinctual part of the mind, while the superego represents the adherence to societal expectations and rules. And the ego is the aspect of your mind that has to moderate between these 2 extremes. And as you might have figured out, the 3 individuals that make up the Freudian Trio are based on these 3 aspects of the mind. For example, in Demon Slayer, Inosuke would be the id, Zenitsu would be the superego, and Tanjiro would be the ego. In Jujutsu Kaisen, the trio would be Nobara, Megumi, and Yuji, in the same order as earlier. In Naruto, it would be Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. In Attack on Titan, it's Eren, Mikasa, and Armin, at least until something happens. In Promised Neverland, it's Emma, Rei, and Norman, so on and so forth. The list is really never ending. But the point is, this trio is everywhere in anime, and the shonen demographic specifically. And it's become so common that it kinda feels like a given. You gotta have your main 3 boys in the same way you need a deadbeat dad or episode-long fight sequence. But in this video, I wanted to talk about some of my favorite iterations of this trope and what makes it work or fall flat within any given series. One of the biggest things that comes up when thinking about the Freudian Trio in general is the big question of why. Why would you set up your characters like this, and what makes this trope so unbelievably popular? So to kind of set the scene of the medium we're talking about, anime is very comfortable using stock tropes and archetypes to set up its characters. There's a lot of reasons why, but it kind of has to do with how toxic the manga world is, with how quickly a story has to hit the ground running to be successful. But regardless of the reasons, anime and manga do this thing where they introduce massive casts of characters that have maybe 1 or 2 characteristics that set them apart. My Hero Academia is notably the king of this, with every member of its incredibly large cast literally having a quirk, which is, at least for a while, the only notable thing about them. But this is also all over a ton of other shonen series. Attack on Titan, for example, has Sasha, who starts the series as the Potato Girl. And of course, if the series is good, they'll usually go on to develop these characters further, using their initial trait as a springboard. Assassination Classroom has a huge roster of characters that are pretty one-note at the start, but the show invests a lot of time into developing these archetypes into fully fledged people as the series goes on. But getting back to the point, the reason the Freudian Trio is so popular has a lot to do with anime's propensity for using stock characters like this. Aside from just making your characters, one of the biggest challenges of writing a story is finding the dynamics that naturally exist within your cast. For example, in a drama, the writers may lay out all of their characters and spend hours figuring out how they all interact with each other. And then they take the characters that interact the best or most interestingly and codify a dynamic between them. One of the most famous dynamics in TV is the friendship between Troy and Abed in Community. But getting to such a well-defined relationship took the writers a solid half a season to figure out. And as I said earlier, anime, and more specifically manga, just doesn't have that kind of time. They need their characters to come together quickly and already have a well-defined and entertaining dynamic. And that's where the Freudian Trio comes into play. Using a predefined set of archetypes means you can instantly allow for banter and drama and chemistry between your main cast without the time it takes to figure out their dynamic naturally. In addition to this, the Freudian Trio specifically works with a set of archetypes that naturally exists within a lot of shonen media. More often than not, you're already going to have a character that's really hot-headed and impulsive to be your id, or someone that's really standoffish and edgy to be your superego. So then all that you have to do to build out your complete main cast is to add some sort of ego character to moderate between them. Using this method, you can almost instantly have a dynamic between your main characters. The id and superego characters can constantly argue and butt heads, leading to a lot of drama and suspense, and your ego character can bond with either of them and lead to genuine and emotional character moments. And as things progress and you have more time to devote to developing your characters, you can push them forward in other directions and see how their dynamics will naturally change from there. As you may be able to tell, I kind of think about this trope as a crutch that a lot of Japanese media has to use in order to be successful. Using archetypes in your series is great and all, but it can get pretty darn boring to see the same stock characters get reused and recycled over and over between stories. Which is why I think it's really important to focus on developing your characters past the archetypes they may start with. A lot of the best series are the ones that may push their characters so far that they actually break the Freudian Trio. Attack on Titan's latter half, for example, feels so unique and special because of how much Eren has changed. His development removes the id from the group, which feels so appropriate for the show's general tonal shift. The same is true for Kaino's change in Assassination Classroom, where she drops her originally cheerful and kind ego exterior to reveal her more serious and dark motivations. These types of character shifts that allow for individuals to move past their original archetypes is something that I find is vital to making a good series. The reason I love Assassination Classroom's main trio so much is because of the amount they change throughout the story. I already mentioned Kaino's development, but Karma also becomes so much more kind, and Nagisa breaks away from his shyness and insecurity, so that at the end of the show, the Freudian Trio has been completely shattered, and the dynamic they have is something new and unique to this anime. Another aspect of this trope that I think is interesting to talk about is whether or not there's a romance between the individual members of the group. It's very common in shonen media for the main characters to have crushes on each other, whether or not it actually goes anywhere. But one of my favorite examples of a romance between members of a Freudian trio comes in Fullmetal Alchemist, where Edward and Winry end up marrying each other at the very end of the series. Now, in Fullmetal Alchemist, Edward is the id, the hyperactive and impulsive side of the group, and Winry is the superego, the strict and logical one. And from that initial pitch, it may sound a bit dicey for these two archetypes to end up with one another. After all, they embody two opposite sides of the group dynamic. And this kind of seems to hold true for a lot of the show. The pair ends up at odds with one another quite often, almost always because of Edward's rashness and frequency of injury. But the key component that makes this relationship work is how the pair care for each other and learn to grow together throughout the show. Edward clearly has a lot of love for Winry and only gets upset because he feels responsible for making her sad. And Winry is harsh with Ed only to try and keep him out of danger because she knows how much he cares about him. By the end of the show, the two end up fully on the same page, with Edward sacrificing his powers and finally slowing down to Winry's pace, eventually being the one to propose to her. So as you can see, there's nothing stopping romance from happening, even between characters that are built around the id and superego. But it does take a lot of work and some solid character development to make this happen. For an example of this romance kind of falling apart, we can take a look at the first half of Attack on Titan. So Eren and Mikasa are the id and superego of their series respectively, and they're hinted at having romantic feelings for each other in some capacity. But at least in the first half of the show, you really cannot imagine these two settling down together. And this isn't a mistake on the part of the author, it's reflective of where the characters are at this stage of the story. But it is a really raw and easy to digest example of how id and superego characters can really fail to work together romantically. Eren is one of the purest examples of an id character that you may ever see. He's deeply impulsive and true to his desires, even if they have the tendency to get him and those around him in trouble. In contrast, Mikasa is an extreme example of the superego, a character so stoic and reasonable that it's literally built into her backstory and lineage. And while these two clearly care about each other a lot, their dynamic through a lot of the story is a little bit uncomfy. Eren is anywhere from jealous to openly dismissive of Mikasa for the simple reason that she's more competent than he is. And while Mikasa wants the best for Eren, she often acts overprotective of him and kind of hyperfixates on him, even momentarily losing the will to live once she thinks he's dead. This is a pretty straightforward instance of the id and superego just being very incompatible. At least throughout the first part of Attack on Titan, I really wasn't a fan of their relationship, and I was worried about how much worse it would get if their dynamic ever turned fully romantic. Luckily, I didn't have to worry about that for long, though. Aside from relationships between the id and superego, there isn't too much to talk about regarding romance within the Freudian trio. The very nature of the ego is that it's a neutral force that pairs well with both of the other traits, which makes it pretty simple and easy to pair off one of the two extremes with the more moderate ego, without having to put a lot of work into developing them. This is especially common in shonen where one of the two characters is the protagonist, since the demographic loves a little bit of self-insert fodder. The last thing I wanted to mention regarding this trope would be the interesting variations on it that I found when looking through other shonen series. Chainsaw Man specifically is a fairly interesting example. Power is an incredibly true-to-form example of id, with how sincere she is to her desires and impulses. And Aki is a pretty reasonable superego, since he literally acts as the caretaker and supervisor of the group. But Denji is a really unique case. He's very impulsive and motivated by his desires while also being really empathetic and emotionally weary. And he kind of brings out both sides depending on the situation, acting as another troublemaker for Aki to contend with, or being so sad and broken that he seeks any form of emotional release. Honestly though, most of this ambiguity is probably due to the fact that Chainsaw Man is just hard to categorize using such conventional archetypes. It's a very well-written series that kind of breaks a lot of the tropes that it sets for itself, which is why it's such a futile game to try and pin the Freudian Trio on the show. Lastly, I really like the variation that exists within Code Geass, where Suzaku and Lelouch are the id and superego, and also longtime childhood friends. But their inherent differences in character and worldview eventually result in them having to become enemies, with their feud becoming the primary emotional focus of pretty much the entire series. And for a while, it seems like the pair are just straight up opposites, a Freudian trio without an ego to balance it. And then for a very brief window, we get some hope of resolution in the form of Princess Euphemia, a character that is able to reason with both Lelouch and Suzaku, finally seeming to unite them for a time. But then comes a great tragedy where Euphemia is removed from the story, and from there Lelouch and Suzaku's anger towards each other only surges. I just think it's interesting to view the story as this clash between such opposing sides of the human psyche, almost showing how destructive these two forces can be when at odds. And without an ego to unite them, they continue on their diverging paths until it eventually results in an unknowable amount of violence and suffering. Anyways, that's all I have for this video. I just had this thought the other day about how often I've seen trios in anime, and with a little bit of research, I realized there was a really interesting reason as to why. And I found that cool enough to want to share with you guys. I hope you all learned something and found the topic as cool as I did. Thank you so much for watching.